One of the important things about a culture of accommodation is that it's not enough to be willing to accommodate people, but we have to find a way to make people feel free to ask. Because many of us don't ask for what we need. We self-censor because we're afraid of how it might affect other people, what reactions others might have. An important part of a culture of accommodation is asking for what we need as an example to help others feel free to ask for what they need. And to be prepared to be told no, or not exactly. You see, people feel more free to ask when they know that if their ask is too much, they're confident that they will be told that it's too much. Because if you're afraid that people will accommodate you no matter how much of a problem it might be, that leads back to self-censorship. Sometimes accommodating is easy. We do it so often and so automatically that we hardly think of it as accommodation at all. Other times it's more difficult, and that's what today's reading is about. It's called On the Other Hand, written by Ramon Selove. Suppose I was left-handed. Is it easy to see that there's nothing inherently inferior about left-handedness? It's just a difference, right? No better, but no worse. On the other hand, what if left-handedness is rare and I live in a society that assumes right-handedness? What if they make machines for right-handed operators? What if they write from left to right so that the right-handed people will not smear their ink? What if I learned to write using my left hand, smearing the words? Or used my clumsy right hand so no one could read my writing? Would I be called a low-functioning lefty? On the other hand, what if I twisted my left hand awkwardly to avoid smearing the ink? What if I managed to write just well enough that the right-handed folks could tell what I was trying to write? Would I then qualify as a high-functioning lefty? Left-handedness is not itself disabling, but the expectations of a society might be disabling. Do they have to be? In this modern world of typed words on computers, what does it matter? But I am not left-handed. I am autistic, in a world where most folks are neurotypical. It's just another different way of thinking, right? No better, but no worse. Is that harder for you to see? What if the rules of polite behavior are made by and for neurotypicals? What if the nature of normal relationships assumes neurotypicality? What if the very definition of empathy itself amounts to this? How well do you understand neurotypical people? If with supreme effort I awkwardly pass, will I be called a high-functioning autistic? On the other hand, suppose I decide to use the strengths of the differences of my brain. Suppose I achieve great things that neurotypical brains cannot. If my society can't or won't notice, would that make me a low-functioning autistic? On the other hand, what if society could learn to accommodate my differences and utilize my strengths, just as it can do with left-handedness? Would we all be better for it?
So we're going to start out by acting out a little scene for you. So here's the setting. I'm in graduate school, and I show up to one of my classes, and I notice that one of my fellow classmates is sitting in the seat that I always sit in. So I walk in, and I freeze. And apparently he freezes too.
Test.
Hi, Nathan.
Hey! How you doing?
As a neurotypical, which means not autistic, obviously I'm acting here, I immediately notice the discomfort. Is that on your face or your posture?
It's the face. It's the face.
I immediately notice the discomfort on Nathan's face. Oh wow, there it is. What's wrong, Nathan?
So is that where you're going to sit?
This is where you usually sit, right?
Yeah, it is. It is. That is where I normally sit.
Okay.
Can I sit there?
Would you like me to move?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be. I mean,
Okay,
if
I
it's
can do
not
that.
too much trouble. If it's not too much trouble.
Yeah, I could do that. You mean now?
Yeah. So in that class, I felt comfortable enough to ask the person to move. Now, I was awkward about it because I'm an awkward individual, but we had created a culture of accommodation in my graduate school that made me feel like I wouldn't be judged too harshly. Even if I was a little bit sassy with it, even if I was a little bit weird about it, he did move. And what's interesting is that even though he did move, I don't think he fully understood what was going on in my brain. Now, a lot of people might hear that, and a lot of neurotypicals might even relate to it. They might think, oh yeah, I have a specific place that I like to sit. Maybe you all are sitting in the seats that you always like to sit in, or some of you are, some of you aren't. But it's a little bit different for me. It wouldn't just be mild discomfort for me to sit in another seat. It would truly throw me off for at least the first 30 minutes of that class as I tried to adjust myself to, okay, this is where I'm sitting now. You're okay, Nathan. And it would have actually made it difficult for me to listen to the beginning of the discussion, to pay attention to the rest of the discussion. Now, we don't always have to understand why an accommodation might be necessary. But making sure that people are able to ask about it, making sure that people have the comfort to come out and say, this is what I need, is important to creating a culture of accommodation. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about a different framing for how we view disability. And then I want to discuss a little bit about how my life has been impacted by this different framing, and then specifically how we as a community can build a better culture of accommodation within this community. So first off, how many academics do we have in here? You'll enjoy this first part. So, throughout the course of human history, there have been three primary ways in which people have viewed disability. Three models: the moral model, the medical model, and the social model. Now, the moral model was the most prominent one throughout most of human history, and in fact, in the world today is still the most prominent one, which is a little bit concerning. So the moral model views disability as some type of moral failing, or at least it results from some type of moral failing, meaning that sin has been introduced into society, and as a result, disability has appeared. Disability has been sent down by some type of divine being. Now, there are different ways people might view that. Some people might view it as the fault of the person with the disability and assume that if a person has a disability, that must represent some type of moral failing in their regard, or demonic possession, because people believed that and still believe it. And unfortunately, this would sometimes result in stories of children being drowned in the well at birth. Now, sometimes they might see it another way. Sometimes they might think it's some type of moral failing on the part of the parents. So you become more judgmental of the parents, and the child becomes something to stigmatize because parents don't want people to think that they have some type of moral failing. But then there's another approach where it is on society. Basically, the disabled person is sent into the world, sent into the society by some type of divine being that wants to give the people a test. And if you pass it, then you have redeemed yourself. Ideally, that would mean, here is a disabled person, it is your job to take care of this disabled person. Now, that last one might not sound so bad, but it still does treat the disabled person like an object. So let's move on to a different model. Perhaps see if we can find something that's a little bit less dehumanizing and patronizing. So let's talk about the medical model. Now, the medical model views the disability as being something that comes from just genetic luck of the draw, or perhaps injury, of course. But the important point is, there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's no intelligent design that has decided this person is going to have a disability. Instead, it just happens. It's nature. And of course, if nature is the cause, then nature must be the solution. Or at least, overcoming nature must be the solution. So the primary drive of a person who follows a medical model point of view is to correct the disability, or to prevent the disability. Now, there are different approaches to that as well, like with the moral model. One approach is one that I think that most of America is a little bit more familiar with and usually tends to default to, which is you do what you can to mitigate the effects of the disability, all right? Or to try to make the person normal, or at least what society deems normal. But of course, there's another approach to the medical model, which is to try to protect society from the individual, like the Nazis did, which, by the way, they learned from the United States. The United States does have a troubling history with eugenics, and in fact, a troubling contemporary as well. It is still legal to forcibly sterilize a person with a disability in, I believe it's 33 states, 32 states, if they're under conservatorships or guardianships. That is still legal in the United States. So that is one approach by the medical model as well. Now, even if we are interpreting the medical model as, in its best light, it still does view the disability as an inferiority, and there are a lot of things that leaves out. There's a lot of important context that does not take into account. So let's talk about the social model. Oh, that moves up. The social model argues that disability, the origin of disability, is society. That disability itself is a social construct. Now, a lot of people might be thinking, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that disability is a social construct, so if somebody, is paralyzed, or if somebody has autism, that's just a fabrication of society? Not exactly. See, the social model argues that disability is a result of impairment plus society. Everyone has impairments, but not every impairment is viewed as a disability. As a show of hands, how many people in here wear glasses or contacts? Out of curiosity, as a result of that specific thing, that specific trait, not any other traits, just that trait, would you consider yourself disabled? Perhaps for some people. But usually we don't view those types of vision impairments as being a disability. I mean, it depends on how severe it might be, and it depends on what type of accommodation you can get for it. But there's that word again, accommodation. The reason why we're not as quick to view visual impairments, such as, that might be corrected or accommodated by glasses or contacts, is because it's so common. Almost a majority of you raised your hand, and a majority of you have glasses or contacts, which means that you had an accommodation. You were able to be helped by that. So because it's something that is so easily accommodated, we don't even think of it as a disability. An example of another impairment. There's a show of hands. How many of you all can run 70 miles per hour? How many of you all own a car? Own a car, yeah. That's an accommodation. Because the inability to run 70 miles per hour is an impairment. But it's not a disability because nobody else can do that. The fastest person alive can run what? Like maybe 25 miles an hour? And maybe for a little bit? But the average person can't do that, so we come up with accommodations for that. See, accepting a social model framework is recognizing that what makes a disability so disabling for people is because society was not built for us. And it wasn't built for me. When I was growing up, I had struggles on almost every level of my childhood. Socially, I didn't understand my peers. They would do things, and I would try to repeat it, and then I'd get in trouble for it, and they wouldn't. One time I had a friend who flicked his pencil across the room, and everybody laughed. I was like, oh, that's how you get people to laugh. So I flicked my pencil across the room, and I got in trouble. I didn't understand. I didn't understand when my peers were upset with me. It was hard for me to read them. And not only that, but the classrooms weren't built for me. The cafeteria wasn't built for me. Because I have sensory problems. I have trouble with loud noises, and the cafeteria ladies used to scream into microphones to get us to shut up. And for most kids, they'd be like, that was a little loud. For me, I was like, ah! Society wasn't built for me. My peers, they weren't built for me. And then something changed. Service dogs. My father mentioned that when I was in middle school, I got a service dog. My first service dog's name was Sylvia. She is no longer with us, but she changed my life. She was an important accommodation. Not only did that accommodation make it easier for me to be able to deal with the sensory issues in my daily life, but it also made it easier for me to interact with my fellow students because they like dogs. And it was a conversation starter. And as soon as they figured out, oh, maybe the reason why Nathan is really weird and talks for hours and hours on end about dinosaurs is not because he's just pretentious, it's because he's autistic. It's not because he's weird, it's because he's autistic. The reason why if I express annoyance at him and he doesn't notice it, it's not because he's trying to annoy me, it's because he doesn't know he's annoying me. And I was able to use that. I was able to use that to become a better person, and I think that my peers were able to understand me more and become better people. And it was that one tiny little piece of accommodation that was able to open an entire world for me. A world in which I've had a relatively normal life. In fact, I've had a pretty damn good one. As Dad said, I'm a professor of communication studies. Autism is a communication disorder, and I teach people communication. I tried to warn them before they hired me. I'm also married. I have a wife who I've been with for 8 years now. And in about 4 months, I'm going to be a father. Probably to a neurodivergent person, knowing my genes. And the thing is, all of this has happened not despite me being autistic. Because a lot of aspects of being autistic have actually helped me in my life. The fact that I obsessively studied communication, became better at it, became a master at it, that's because I was autistic. It was because of the hyper-focus that autism gives. It was because of it. And it didn't hold me back because I was receiving accommodations from my service dog, from my parents, from my church community. It was because I had those accommodations and because I was autistic. So with that in mind, how can we become a community that values a culture of accommodation? Well, there's a lot of different things to consider, and based on some of the preliminary things that I've noticed about this church, y'all are well on your way. You have captions for the service. I noticed that oftentimes when you do applause, you do the sign for applause, which not only accommodates people that might be hard of hearing, but it also accommodates people that might have sensory issues with applause. I coach a speech team, and during award ceremonies, people are clapping all over the place, and I have to tilt my head like this because there's people clapping right next to my ear. So I'll actually, in the award ceremonies, I'll be like this. But imagine if we created a culture in which those accommodations were considered proactively. You all have already started that, and that's really great to see, because that was so important for me in my church. That was so important for me growing up. I was a weird kid, and my church community knew it, but luckily they were UU, so they were pretty weird too. There's actually some Nathan legends in my church. When I was like 7 years old, we had an RE teacher who was talking about the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction. A UU, because we welcome people of all different political persuasions. And 7-year-old Nathan walks up to this teacher and says, "Well, there are no weapons of mass destruction, but that's just my opinion." By the way, I was right, so... But the thing is, they welcomed that. They welcomed those quirks. They loved those quirks. They loved me for it. And that not only taught me that I could be myself, but it also helped me understand how to accommodate other people. Because the fact of the matter is, sometimes accommodations can kind of get in the way of each other. Meaning you might be trying to accommodate one person, and it makes it so you struggle accommodating another person. And part of what opened me up to wanting to learn more about how I could accommodate people, how I could be nicer to people, how I could try to make sure that I was always taking people's feelings into account, was the fact that they had opened themselves up to me first. So, the things to always consider. Be proactive. If you do have something that you need accommodated, don't be afraid to ask. And if you are the person who is in charge of accommodation, listen. If you are somebody who is in charge of planning an event, consider who's going to be here. What might they need? What can I do for them? And if there is a case of accommodations that might get in the way of each other, think outside the box. For example, my dog is my accommodation. Some people have dog allergies. So, those accommodations might get in the way of each other. So it might make sense to proactively think, well, let's make sure that the person with the dog and the person with the dog allergy are sitting in different parts of the room. And in fact, depending on how severe the allergy might be, oftentimes just if a person has a severe allergy, if they're just sitting next to somebody who has a dog, not even someone where the dog's with them, but they have a dog at home, they might have a bunch of dander on them. So maybe you have a section that's a dander-free section where people that have dogs at home don't sit over there. Things like that, thinking outside the box. It's clear that you all already care about it. It's clear that you want to make this happen, and it's clear that you're already taking steps to do so. It's clear that you're already developing that culture. Don't stop. Push forward. Because when my kid is born, I'm going to be proud to tell them that I grew up in a Unitarian Universalist church that accommodated me, and I hope to raise them in a Unitarian Universalist church that accommodates them.